So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us newly back in person and hybrid on Zoom as always. Good to have everybody here. And if you're on Zoom and wondering whether you should come or able to come, we have a wonderful spread of brownies and cookies and fruit and bagels.
Coffee.
Yes.
It's a second or third breakfast. And so this morning we are going to be studying the portion of bow. So the portion. Oh. No, he doesn't even need it.
I don't know why he uses it, he never takes it.
So the portion of bow is the end of the plagues and the beginning of the Exodus. And what I thought we would look at today and study more in depth is going to be the plague of darkness, which is the second plague in the Parsha, and the plague of the firstborn. And I think probably of all the plagues, these are the two most interesting plagues. Yes, please. Yeah. See, that's what it sounds like when that's what it sounded like in Egypt.
Oh, that's your house.
That's what it sounds like in my house. That's a calm night in my house. Because the portion begins with the plague of the locust, and the plague of the locust is an interesting plague. But really, the plague of darkness, and as we go through the plague of the firstborn, really brings into focus what's most intense about the plagues and some of the most interesting themes of the confrontation between Pharaoh and Moses and God, and coming to know who God is and what God is about. Hello, Nancy.
Oh, good.
Great to have you join us too.
Nancy.
Yeah, there's a great. If you want, there's breakfast and everything available.
Is there who?
There's a, we'll get to
This one, I'll get it.
No, Norma's getting one. Okay, good.
Sorry.
So this is the methodology that we've been following. We've just been looking at the Hebrew ourselves and going through in the English and the Hebrew and talking about it. And then we bring the commentators afterwards to add an extra level. But really, we've been having some great discussions without even looking at the commentary. And that's what we've been doing. So we're going to begin with the plague of the darkness. So we're on page 376 in the Humashim. If you're at home, we're at chapter 10, verse 21 of Exodus. Chapter 10, verse 21. And we'll actually start a little bit before, just to catch up a little bit on the previous plague, the very end of the locust. So we're going to start at verse 19 of chapter 10 of Exodus, the very end of the plague of the locust, and then we're going to read through the darkness. And if we have time, we'll get to the plague, to the very last plague, Makat Bechorot, the plague of the firstborn. So, as always, maybe before we begin, anybody have any leftover thoughts or comments from last week? Last week we talked about the revelation of God's new name, God as Redeemer, God as the ground of being, but also God who acts in the world.
I had a question
Sure.
about the name of God.
Sure.
It's for Abraham, it's El Shaddai, and I had been taught at one point that Shaddai was an acronym for Guardian of the Doors of Israel. Is that original, or is that an interpretation that has come later?
We're in the Shomer of the Daltot Israel. Yeah, very beautiful. Well, I mean what most biblical scholars think of Shaddai is it comes from the word for breast, And it's because God is a kind of motherly, protecting, nurturing, and it's probably a really ancient name. A sense of, go ahead.
Sorry, wouldn't Shaddai, using Nancy's acronym,
Shomer.
Yeah.
that would be an English acronym from
It
the
would be.
Hebrew,
It would be.
as
wouldn't it?
opposed to the Hebrew name, right? Shaddai, Shin.
Dala, so
Dale.
Shomer,
Right.
so say, yeah, Delet, as we know. is
Yeah,
the
so
Torah.
it seems like
Israel.
somebody might be stretching a little, but it's
It is,
interesting.
yeah,
Okay,
it is definitely more modern. I mean, it's,
thank you.
it's rabbinic, but it could be modern rabbinic. I'm not sure how modern it is. So.
I've got something, not for, I want to bring it up, not for discussion today, but maybe at some point in the future.
Mhm.
And I was listening to a discussion about when Moses killed the Egyptian slave master or taskmaster, and then,
Mhm.
he ran away, and the discussion was, here you have a prince of the royal house of Egypt
Hmm.
where having slaves or the Jewish slaves was not a big deal. And he killed the taskmaster. And wasn't it kind of odd that he was so worried? Because here he is, the prince of Egypt,
Mhm.
and he killed somebody. And it, like most stories you would have heard, it was like, so what? He's a prince, he can get away, he
Whatever he
can do
wants.
whatever he wants. And why did he get worried and, about persecution? And so it's not so much I want any discussion now, but just something to think about. And next time we do that chapter or that story I'd like to discuss it a little.
But maybe a quick comment, which is it's hard for us to separate the movies from the text in our minds. When you actually read the text itself, and it doesn't say anywhere that Moses is a prince. It just says he was brought up in the palace.
Just
he
in
might-
Hollywood.
So exactly. So he might have really been known the whole time that he was a Hebrew, right? It might have been known that he had a status. He didn't have the
Okay.
status of an Egyptian, and also we don't know. The taskmasters may have had a very high status, and might have been even for someone of high status in Egypt to kill an Egyptian. But it would have been, if it was known that Moses was a Hebrew growing up in the palace and he'd killed an Egyptian taskmaster, that might have incurred the wrath of Pharaoh. So
Thank you.
I know in our mind we think of Pharaoh as the prince, as the son of, but that's Hollywood. Yeah, but you could read from, could be in a text, and we just don't know.
Okay.
But, so let's start reading verse 19.
Okay, verse 19. The Lord caused a shift to a very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and hurled them into the sea of reeds. Not a single locust remained in all the territory of Egypt. But the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. Then the Lord said to Moses, hold out your arm toward the sky, that there may be darkness upon the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be touched. Moses held out his arm toward the sky, and thick darkness descended upon all the land of Egypt for 3 days. People could not see one another, and for 3 days no one could get up from where he was, but all the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwellings. Pharaoh then summoned Moses and said, go, worship the Lord. Only your flocks and your herds shall be left behind. Even your children may go with you. But Moses said, you yourself must provide us with sacrifices and burnt offerings to offer up to the Lord our God. Our own livestock too shall go along with us. Not a hoof shall remain behind, for me what we must select from it for the worship of the Lord our God. And we shall not know with what we are to worship the Lord until we arrive there. But the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not agree to let them go. Pharaoh said to him, "Be gone from me. Take care not to see me again. For the moment you look upon my face, you shall die." And Moses replied, "You have spoken rightly. I shall not see your face again." And the Lord said to Moses, "I will bring but one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. After that, he shall let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here, one and all. Tell the people to borrow, each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers, objects of silver and gold." The Lord disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people. Moreover, Moses himself was much esteemed in the land of Egypt, among Pharaoh's courtiers and among the people. Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, toward midnight I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And there shall be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such as has never been or will ever be again. But not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at man or beast, in order that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Then all these courtiers of yours shall come down to me and bow low to me, saying, 'Depart, you and all the people who follow you. After that I will depart.' And he left Pharaoh's presence in hot anger. Now the Lord had said to Moses, 'Pharaoh will not heed you, in order that my marvels may be multiplied in the land of Egypt.' Moses and Aaron had performed all these marvels before Pharaoh, but the Lord had stiffened the heart of Pharaoh, so that he would not let the Israelites go from his land."
Thank you.
So wait, I have a question.
Sure.
Well, one comment, one question. The Lord stiffened the heart of Pharaoh, so they wouldn't, why would he do that? I mean, that makes
I
it,
wondered the same thing.
yeah, I mean, it's in two different
Yeah,
places
he's
and I.
pulling and pushing
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
same
yeah,
time.
push, pull, click,
Mhm.
click.
Of
what-
course, who are we to question? the ways
No,
of
I'm
the
not, but I
Lord?
just don't. I'm
Well,
not sure.
What happened, I once did a whole class, or maybe it was a sermon on this, where at the beginning of the plagues, Pharaoh just says no. Then Pharaoh begins to stiffen his own heart. If Pharaoh is, and at the end, God is stiffening
So
his heart.
I could
So,
understand that Pharaoh is just doing it, he's just
Yeah.
being mean, but
yeah,
why is God doing that?
what do you think?
I can't figure it out.
To
It's
build
got-
up the tension in the
Yeah,
story.
it's
In the
got to
story?
be intentional in some way. I'm thinking there's got to be a reason. Maybe it's setting the house of Israel up for deliverance. Maybe it's to beat down the Egyptians.
To
and to-
rise up or
Well,
something.
eight plagues doesn't sound as good as 10 plagues, so you have to
Yeah,
have the
yeah,
full. But I mean, the most problematic part is he's taking away his free will, right? He's taking away Pharaoh's free will. So the way the commentator, one of the way the commentators deal with it is they say at a certain point, Pharaoh, what he really wanted was to say to them no, but he was so afraid of God that he was about to say yes. But what all that God did was really give him what he wanted in his hearts of hearts, was to not allow the slaves to go. So if God hadn't supernaturally been doing these plagues, Pharaoh would never have allowed them to go. So he was, in some ways, where others say there is a point where you've gone so far that your free will doesn't mean anything anymore. It's just you've gone.
The other thing is that over the years, non-Jewish friends of mine have said, you're
Your God is an
Bible
angry God.
says such terrible things. Your God is so mean, cruel.
Well, at this point.
Yeah. Well, and in different places it comes up. So how do you answer somebody like that?
Do you think God comes across as mean for doing it? For what part do you?
Not to me as a Jew, but
But the
but
God,
as a non-Jew, they say your God does a lot of not things that aren't nice.
I mean, there's,
Maybe they don't understand the
It's-
reasoning
I
behind
mean, I
it.
think, I mean, it's the God of the Torah and the God of the Bible is a kind God, but it's also God where we see him doing, God's anger appears many times as well. But
Are they saying that when they say your God,
Your God, yeah,
It's-
it's their God too,
it's,
right? Yeah.
it's a God who has changed, who has developed?
They just feel that in this Bible, that it just
I
appears.
mean,
to be-
there's different ways of looking at it. One is if you look at the world around us, there are good things and not so good things that happen in our world. So if
Right.
you believe that God is a God of our world, then you have to say that there's things that happen in this world that, I mean, if you only say the good things come from God and the not so good things
Right.
just happen, but
But isn't that what
But-
people do when something bad is happening in their life? They get mad at God.
Well,
When
this
something
is-
good is, they say, oh, you
it's the
know,
thing.
Right.
praise God.
Well, that's the story of Job, right? It's like, why?
Well, usually people don't say, when something good is, they say, oh, thank God. They say, well, it was a joke. I just heard this from Cantor a few days ago. Like somebody comes and he's trying to park his car and there's no parking place anywhere. And he's like, oh no, and got my theater tickets. I said, God, please, can you give me a parking place? And finally, you see, just at that moment, he sees a car move out. He says, God, never mind.
Instead of
You know,
thank
so
you.
I think that for a lot of people, that's, when it's the opposite. It's when we really need God, right? When we really need God, we say, that was coming out of a conversation with somebody here who was saying, the time I really pray is when I'm on a plane and there's turbulence, and that's, because he says, I'm not sure if God's gonna help me, but it doesn't hurt for me to pray, right? So I think that when we're in those moments, but I mean, to the scholars and from a point of theology, to the especially before Job, to the people of the Torah, I mean, it was odd. They had no problem. God did everything. God made the good things and God made the bad things. And the bad things, either you couldn't explain them or you thought, oh, what did I do? Or I must have done something wrong. We have a more complex way of thinking about it. But in the Torah, everything comes from God, good and bad. And,
But as a stiffening of heart, I'm just thinking that perhaps
Yeah.
he didn't want to just give it to them. Here, I'm gonna make Pharaoh soften up and he'll let you go. No, you people have to like help
Yeah.
yourselves to get out of here.
well, from the beginning, he says, Pharaoh's not going to let you go, and I'm going to show my wonders and miracles. And I mean, so part of the whole purpose of the plagues, and they've been enslaving them even for 200 or 400 years. So there's, if you sow what you reap, or I don't know how you want to look at it, or maybe Pharaoh. And I do personally at least resonate with some of those commentators that say Pharaoh really did not want to let them go. He was getting so scared from all these things that were coming to him. But if he'd really been able to operate his own being, he would have not let them go.
He didn't have any wizards.
he didn't
who could
really
do
have-
it? Who could-
He didn't have.
Yeah, magicians.
Yeah, how about the
I
magician?
do remember reading
Mhm.
the early plagues were really plagues that could have been or were duplicated by Pharaoh's magicians.
Mhm.
The later plagues were plagues that only God could have done. And so maybe that's some of what we're seeing is the beginning. If Pharaoh would have let the Jews go, let the Hebrews go after the first couple of plagues, the people might have said,
What's the difference between our God and the
Right.
magicians? That's
Yeah,
nice,
yeah,
that's
and,
beautiful.
by it continuing, it shows the power of the Hebrew God.
I mean, God had a purpose through all of this, which was to reveal himself. At the beginning, Pharaoh says, I do not know who this God is. Who is this God? And so they go
Right.
through the whole plagues for Pharaoh and the Egyptians to know God, but also the Israelites had to come to know God. And so the part of the Israelites knowing God was to know that God was also not just able to turn a staff into a snake, not even able to bring frogs, which you could say could have been by a half natural means. But the more you progress, as you were saying, the more supernatural it is. And a God who can do this, that's a powerful God. That's a God who has power over life and death and can do anything. And then you get to the sea, and it's even greater display of power. And so, if it'd been the first few plagues, maybe we wouldn't be reading about it today, right? Maybe we wouldn't be. But the fact that you're reading about it, within the context of the story, there is when we read through it, we see the human actors, they're just going through it. But the point of view of God has a plan from the beginning, right? God is just carrying through his plan, and the human actors are acting this way or that way. Even Moses doesn't quite know everything that's going to happen, right? But God is from the point of view of the story, God is omniscient and knows everything, and God has his or her plan and is going to carry through it to the end.
I also get the impression in reading this that the Hebrew slaves were, I always, I guess, think of the slaves as living off in their particular quarter, and they're separated from society. But here you've got the mention of other slaves. There's the slave girl who's behind the millstones that's going to lose her firstborn child. And also where it says, go borrow objects of silver and gold from your neighbor.
Very difficult.
Which means that they were all living together. So it kind of made me wonder what separated, if anything, really separated the Hebrews from the other people.
You mean their slavery, or do you mean their?
Well, were they the same kind of slaves, or if they're all living in the same area, were there any distinctive things that the Hebrews did that was different from other slaves, that whether they were slaves who were Egyptian or slaves from other tribes who were slaves of Pharaoh? But, were they all just kind of treated the same? And
then it brings up, of course, the morals and ethics of why did the other slaves have to die at the same time as the Egyptians? I mean, just from the story itself, it seems like the Israelites were especially enslaved to do construction work, right? That they were used in their multitudes to build the cities, and their slavery was really focused on that, and then the having to get the straws, and that there were a whole nation enslaved. Throughout the ancient worlds, there were slaves of all kinds, different status. If you're a slave, we don't really know, but it was very normative for all the societies, for the wealthy to have servants and slaves, and we're not.
Phil's trying to say something.
Phil, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. No, well, thank you. Can we do another beat on the hardening or the toughening of the heart?
Sure.
For just a second, enormous question. I don't really stand by this, but it's one of the traditional explanations, as I understand it, is if you look at the plagues throughout, you go through them, you don't see, I think this is correct me if I'm wrong, that you don't see the hardening of the heart until the last triad or the last few plagues, something like that. And so, we're focusing on one, but when you do that, then the explanation of that, and I don't know if this is in Maimonides, or maybe it's in the early rabbis, I don't know, that it's a question. Pharaoh has acted in a certain way, and he's been habituated to behaving a certain way. That to me is kind of a Greek explanation. It's like it's something Aristotle might have said. It's the the ethics of virtue and having good habits. So Pharaoh had these bad habits, and so hardening the heart is in a way a figurative account of the state of his soul, something like that. I don't, I'm not here to apologize for that or explain, but I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, and that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, did you want to say something?
No, I went for someone saying that God greased the tracks in the direction
Right.
Pharaoh's already moving.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah, I want to make a comment on I just want to follow up on what Phil said, because, it's funny, it was running through my head. I knew someone several years ago, really nice man who's an atheist. And he told me that there was a point in his life when something really tragic happened. And his first impulse was to call out to God to help him, to save him. And in that split second, he said, no, I'm not going to be a hypocrite. I'm not going to call out to God. And it's funny you should say that. Yeah.
It's I mean, there is a progression throughout the plagues, where first, it's his heart just seems to have complete, free will. He says, no, I do not know this God. Our magicians are better. And that's actually quite interesting. If you get to the middle plagues, it says Pharaoh his own heart. So in some ways, you can making himself strong, but it does, where his heart wanted about greasing to push. But in the text itself, it does seem like it's God who's doing it, right? That God is purposefully hardening his heart. But I mean, then it happens again, right? At the very last, before he goes to run after the fleeing Israelites, God again hardens his heart, and then he runs after the Israelites, and they all. And I think it is interesting to note at the same time that we do have also traditions that when all the Egyptians were in the sea, God was also grieving for them and grieving for their death, and saying, "Aren't they my children too?" So we have those traditions as well. It's not.
David's been awfully quiet today.
Yeah.
Is that because Bonnie's
Well,
not there?
the hardening the heart thing, of course, is very interesting. But and I'm not sure what I personally think about that. But it sort of brings up to me what's the separation between the divinity that we're talking about in Pharaoh. Everybody here has the view that God is something totally separate from us, lives in a high place like a king, and can do what he wants when he wants. He's sort of like a real big king, a king that has powers.
Sovereign of sovereigns.
He's an Alta-Cocker king. Anyway, my feeling of the divine is very different.
Your Zoom connection might get zapped.
So when I hear that God is hardening the heart of Pharaoh, I think that the distinction between Pharaoh and the divinity is disappearing. So it isn't God that's hardening Pharaoh's heart. It's Pharaoh that's hardening his own heart. Now, why it says that God's doing it, I'm not sure what that actually means at that point. But I don't think that there's a divinity that's separate from Pharaoh at this particular point. Maybe Pharaoh, I don't know. I don't know how to even talk about that issue.
It makes more sense what you just said.
Yeah, that Pharaoh would be
Yeah, that
hardening
Pharaoh
his
is
own
hardening
heart,
his own.
yeah.
Mhm.
So what's the difference between
And
Pharaoh?
that fits in with the stuff that I was saying last week and the week before about the divinity being in some sense a higher version or some kind of a version of ourselves that we might be able to get in touch with as we go deeper into ourselves.
I mean, it is very interesting because in Judaism, we have both of those ideas. I mean, the one you're talking about maybe later, but it's hard to get away from the very core of this text, which is a God that can act in the world and shake up. That's the very purpose of this entire story. And it's very uncomfortable for us moderns because we don't want to see God that way. We'd rather see God as the self of all selves, as the inborn spark of God within, as the capital S. But in some ways, the whole purpose of this story is to say that at least that's how it's presented and how later tradition sees it. And right, all of your other gods are gods of stone and wood, but our God is the living God who came down and acts. But why would God, change people's hearts? I mean, I'm not sure how I completely resonate with this idea, but that on some level, God is behind the scenes. This is behind the scenes, right? Because if we didn't know this text, we would know that God is doing this, right? This is behind the scenes look that sometimes God overturns free will to make things move in a way to fulfill his will. I don't know if anybody can think of another time where God might do that for someone to make something happen. But if the only thing that I would say, this is from my point of view, that I would hope, if we live in a world of justice, that where you pay a price for everything you do, so to speak, after you die, and you have an accounting, right? We have this belief that you have an accounting when you die. The Pharaoh would not have to account for the times or for the things that he did when his heart was hardened, right? That's what you would hope for. This doesn't go against him in the great balancing of the cosmic balancing. And this is something that had to happen. And then maybe, so this, again, as I said, this is the way some of the commentators say it. He was so evil, and the way later traditions view pharaohs, a pharaoh wasn't even just a man who was believing in his own divinity, but he was the embodiment of evil, almost as close to a kind of Satan as we would get, right? In the Kabbalah, pharaoh lives in the palace of the 49 gates of impurity and is like wielding cosmic forces of evil, so to speak. So pharaoh is this evil spiritual being, not only a physical being, and that this was God coming in and completely wiping away this kind of cosmic force of evil. So in that context, God was saying, not only am I stronger than you, Pharaoh, but also I'm overriding your very sense of thinking you're in control and you're able to act in this world. So in some ways, it makes God even more powerful. And what it does, I think it also sets up this idea of the power of the redeeming force in the universe. I think that's something that we can all connect to, that there's the power of the redeeming force in our world is so powerful, will do anything to show us that power and to yield us, and even and how deeply, maybe even the way to connect to it from a personal point of view is, even when we ourselves get so stuck in that Egypt, so stuck in those ways, we all have those ways where we just can't get out of them, that even from that place, God will come with an outstretched hand and help redeem us from our own bondages and take us out. And sometimes even our own force, our own being is not strong enough to get us out of there, but God will help shift that.
Well, this is the ultimate redemption story, right? I mean, it's the whole basis of Judaism, of faith. But if the Lord can harden, and this Pharaoh is the most powerful human on the planet at the time, right? Because Egypt is the empire of this time. So I'm just wondering if God can triumph over the most powerful human on the planet, and I think that's kind of the intent, right? Then also the Lord can soften a potentate's heart, right? I'm thinking like Cyrus in Ezra and Nehemiah, right?
Beautiful.
Where they're already in exile, but yet Ezra says, and the Lord, I don't know what the exact words are, but the Lord softens King Cyrus's heart to allow the remnants
To
to return and
return.
rebuild Jerusalem, right?
Mhm.
So I'm thinking maybe it's metaphorical. Because Cyrus also at the time was the most powerful human king on the planet. And yet somehow there's this, not somehow, there is divine intervention that causes these super powerful humans to
'Cause they-
change their ways.
Because it changes history when they do so.
Yeah.
But I mean, as you were talking, something came up to me. I thought was interesting. Is I mean, softening there seems a very small adjustment, right? It's almost like it can go either way. And for us too, you know, softening or hardening, you can go either way in the moment, right? You could, in the moment, I mean, we all have those moments in our lives, you know, where you could continue one path, you could go to the other, and the shift from one to the other is very, very little. You can continue arguing with someone, or you can just go the other way and walk away from it, right? That's a pretty minor shift. And maybe in Pharaoh's heart, it was a very minor shift at that moment, right? I mean, we also see Moses. Moses could have easily allowed Pharaoh to have his way. No, Pharaoh says, "You can all go. We can all go." What does Moses say? He doesn't say. He says, "Not only that, but you have to give us the animals to sacrifice." Right? Moses also pushes it. You know, Moses is also taking it to its logical conclusion. Moses is himself not. He's saying we've gotten this far. We're going to get to the very end, right? And the tables have turned at this point too. At the beginning, Pharaoh still thinks, I'm in charge at this moment.
Wasn't,
Go ahead.
and we never talked about this, wasn't Pharaoh considered a god?
Pharaoh is considered a god. Probably thought of himself a god.
You know, I mean, whether Moses thought of him as a god, we don't know what the Hebrews thought of him as, whether they considered him a god or a human. So, but it, you know, this whole fight could be seen as not just a god and a human, but two gods fighting one another for control.
But one of the commentaries, I hope we'll actually get to it. We're running out of time, but when they'll say, well, why did God kill all of the cattle? You know, why did God kill the firstborn of the cattle in Egypt as well? And so one of the commentaries is that the cattle that he killed were the cattle that were considered to be gods by the Egyptian. And the part of all of this was just a message in every possible way. Who is the real God? So God, even Pharaoh's child, Pharaoh's obviously not a god, but even showing that Pharaoh is not a god, but even the slaves of other nations who also worshipped other gods. They didn't. I'm not sure what I think about this, but the commentators say they didn't want them to think, oh, it's because I prayed to my God, the God. No, he wanted everybody to know there is one. There is just this is the real God. All the other gods are stone and wood, are nothing compared to one God. I mean, it does send you couldn't imagine a stronger message than that with this final plague. It's very, very hard to read, really, to all these people dying. Even as you, I mean, who are we to do with the moral balance? But it's so what about the plague of the darkness? How does that? Does that
Rabbi,
go ahead. Yeah.
Shalom, everybody. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is what you're saying is so true, and I don't remember who said this about the face-off between the God of the Hebrews and the gods of the Egyptians, right? Like I mentioned last week, the Egyptians had a lot of gods, right? Made of stone and deities, and therefore, and I think that this is God's demonstration of his absolute power to face off this human God versus him who is the absolute power. If we look at some of the plagues that were introduced in Vayera, for example, the plague of the frogs, that was challenging a goddess of the Egyptians. I can't pronounce the name, but I think it's something like Huk or Hek or something like that. And this one that you just talked about, the darkness, this one is a more popular god in the Egyptian studies, but this one is Re, right? Re, this goddess of the sun. So God is challenging these deities and Pharaoh, who is a human god, to demonstrate his absolute power and to show that he is above all and he's everything and all. Just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much. Well, it's really, I mean, some people have gone and really mapped out all the different plagues and shown how they all correspond to Egyptian gods. And they said, right, the blood of the sheep on the lintel, the sheep were considered God. You know, so even then it was a matter of the Egyptian gods symbolically being taken down by the god of, I mean, I've shared this before, but there's some scholars who believe that in some ways the whole Torah is a story of how the God of the Hebrews, our God, asserts his dominance over all gods, right? It says, Mi chamocha ba'elim, right? We say, who is like you among the gods? So maybe at first the Hebrews might have been like, oh, there's many gods, but our God is, the God almost like kills all the other gods throughout all the stories of God gets rid of them until God is the only God left in the pantheon, right? And don't think that there are any other gods. There's only one God. And the whole story of this is the God of our monotheism. It becomes more and more the only cult in ancient Israel. But one part of this story, which I feel is now working on a symbolic level, but in some ways makes it feel so real, is that even, I mean, the power that God unleashes over Egypt, even God doesn't have perfect control over it, right? Because God has to give them a methodology for it not getting to them. God can't just say, okay, Jew, if you're Jewish, and I know I'm God, so I know the names of every single Jew, and you know you're Moshe and you're Shlomo and you're Rivka, so you're okay. But God has to have them do a sign, right? He has to have them put a sign over the door. And there's a midrash that some of the Jews said, "I'll be all right." And they left. They went out of their houses, which they weren't supposed to, but they got stricken down by the angel of death. So there's a sense that the powers being unleashed on they are mysterious, and we how can we truly understand what those powers are? But that it's not that God wasn't in control of them, but it's that they were still working within the boundaries of our world on some kind of level. I mean, these are all very mysterious things that are happening. It's not like God had a list, these are all the Egyptians, these are all the Jews, but that they're still working within supernatural laws and everything that is happening. And to me, it makes the story feel more real on some level, more tangible at least, less just a symbolic story, but something that has some kind of, it's working within a certain logic, even though the logic is one that how can we understand? The darkness as a ninth plague, at least to me, makes sense because compared to all the other plagues, it seems like another one was working on a much greater level.
Anybody who lives in Alaska will tell you that darkness for so many months is an overwhelming depressive
That's true.
feeling.
Yeah. But
I have a question. I have a question out of the text, because
Yeah.
it says that everybody was well disposed toward the Israelites. And I've kind of always looked at that and said, well, all these plagues were hitting the Egyptians. And that just seems like a strange juxtaposition to me. It seems to me, if I were an Egyptian and all these things were happening to me as a result of, you know, Moses trying to God getting the people out, I would start to resent these people who brought all these plagues on top of me, but that's not what it says. And so I know this is part of my ignorance, so I'm just tossing it out there as a question.
Well, how do you explain it then? how do you, can you imagine, do you think God shifted their hearts, or do you think that just it happened differently, or did they start cheering for the God of the Hebrews? I mean, it's really strange kind of
If I were to pick something myself, I would say there's something in the character and the lifestyle of the people as a whole that made the Egyptians well disposed towards them as a people. Obviously, Pharaoh wasn't, but that's what I would toss out. But I don't know if that's true or accurate. Because that's usually why people are well disposed. There's something in your character, or your lifestyle that they like about you.
I mean, it's an amazing idea to think that they would have undergone all of those plagues and still be in any way well disposed to the Israelites. Since somebody was about to say something. Anybody else have a thought? How would the Egyptians be well disposed to the?
Well,
I mean, they
in
must
the
have-
explanation here on page 378 at the bottom, it says that the Israelites could have plundered their homes in the darkness, and they didn't do that. So they felt that they were good souls.
I mean, there might have been an awesomeness to witnessing God's power, even though it's striking down on you. And you've got to, if you see it happening, there must be a side of you that's saying, this is the true God, and all these other things are not the true God. And maybe there was, I mean, a searching in their own hearts for having done what they did to the Israelites. Maybe there was a reckoning, a moral reckoning within the average Egyptians who were also benefiting from the enslavement of the. Now we're getting, feels almost like modern language, but but the Egyptians were also they were on the end of it, but it must have been horrifyingly frightening. But also you must have felt this is God. Maybe there was a sense also of awesomeness before the power of God.
Well, and God showing that something good can come from something.
Yeah.
It's hard for us moderns to appreciate serious miracles. I mean, these are sort of grade A+ miracles.
Yeah, really.
If you've had a miracle occur in your own life, that's a real miracle. That's something that's reached outside of a natural happening and either saved you or transported you to a place, then all of a sudden this can become more real for you. But most of us haven't had these kinds of experiences. And it's to have been there, to have had this kind of experience has to be a real blast. I'm not sure exactly what I'm saying, except that it's hard to appreciate.
The Egyptians might not be such a blast. But it's interesting what you're saying, because when I think of people in our day and age who've experienced miracles, what you're talking about, mainly what comes to mind at first are miraculous healings, right? There are stories of people who've had miraculous healings, and sometimes associated with holy sites. I mean, in the Catholic tradition, Lourdes in France is a place where people go and have had miraculous healings, and even the doctors have done research on and said, I can't explain what this is. So there's some things that even though, my father-in-law, who doesn't believe in all this, will say probabilities, you work with probabilities, you're going to get to some of this. But
Science is a religion too.
Science is a religion too. So I think of those people, and in that case, that is going to change your life. It's a transformation. You have a disease that cannot be healed, and suddenly your disease is healed. That's going to change your view forever and convince you of the power of whatever experience, especially if it came with an experience, right? Some people have this, right? Or I mean, I guess near-death experiences. Yeah, people have near-death experiences, and they see things that they couldn't have seen, right? Their spirit went flying, and they saw something that wasn't in their room, and then they reported it back, and that does happen. And you can't explain that, and that will completely change you. I'm not sure if you have a negative plague, if that also has that kind of effect. I mean, it probably will transform you, but it might. it might transform you forever. It might transform you forever. I mean, it might, even though it's negative, I mean, maybe God gives you the power to endure it if you, on some level, maybe not the Pharaoh and to the taskmasters, but maybe God gives the power to endure the plague to all of these, your ordinary Egyptian. And I mean,
The effects of trauma can be permanent.
yeah,
And these plagues are seriously traumatic. I
Mhm.
cannot imagine that anybody who lived through any of these 10 plagues would not have been either traumatized or imprinted in some way by what had happened in a very profound way.
Mhm. Well, it's a mass. Also, we're only used to the idea of individual miracles, right? Very rarely do we have groups of people witnessing what we would call a miracle. I mean, we have the miracles of God. You know, last week we talked about the two names of God. El Shaddai was God who works within nature, and then you have, you know, and we that's a lot more of what we see. I mean, we could. Some people would feel, you know, some of what happened in the early years of the state of Israel felt like that, right? Incredible things happening that, you know, I'm not sure where God is at the moment with what's happening over there, but we hope God's in it
When
too.
those small
But-
band of men fought off those hundreds of
Yeah, exactly.
millions, thousands, I don't know how many people, they couldn't themselves imagine how they had done
Exactly.
that.
So that's God, but that's a miracle, but it's still God working within the limits of nature. But what the commentators say about this is the Yud He Vav He is God the Redeemer who comes down and is completely beyond the bounds of nature. And that's hard because we don't witness that so easily, or we haven't, or maybe
When we do meditation, I always see Vladimir's plaque up there.
Yud He Vav He. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, on the other hand,
Are you going to have time? I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Are you going to hoping to have any time to touch on the commentaries that you provided?
We're going to look a little bit at the commentaries now for 5 minutes. I mean, the truth is they're not dealing with precisely what we talked about, but we will look at them. But maybe just to say that even though we're looking at this and theologically we're looking at the plagues that happen and we're saying to us this feels like something completely outside of nature, completely outside of miracles. Maybe it didn't feel quite that way to the Israelites because they lose faith in God so quickly, right? So maybe in the end it wasn't as transformative as we think it was. Maybe it did feel on some level, even to them, that it was God, you know. And then there was that famous author whose name is now escaping me, who, you know, in the 70s or 80s tried to map out how all the plagues could have been natural coincidences, right? The comets falling down,
Why
or
does somebody have to do that?
and it could have been something. And so, you know, and human beings we forget the feeling of the miraculous. You know, when the Israeli paratroopers took the wall on the 6-day war, some of them had a feeling of miraculous, you know, they believed Mashiach was coming. They blew the shofar. They thought Mashiach is coming, and didn't quite work out that way. But people had, even the secular people there had some kind of mass spiritual experience. At least that's some of the reports of what happened there. So the human beings forget what it's like to have experiences. And certainly, you know, a year later, they're forgotten the power of their God, and they're saying, get us back to Egypt. So how could you have endured the plagues as an Israelite and then saying, take me back to Egypt? It seems unbelievable. But so let's actually get a little bit into the plague of the darkness, just because there's some linguistic stuff that's interesting, but also as one of the plagues that's really beginning to deal with supernatural types of miracles. Phil, would you mind reading for us, since you mentioned it? Let's go through some of these comments on the plague of darkness.
Okay, sure. Let me get into it. I don't recall the vowels, but I'm Choshech. It signifies the darkness mentioned in the preceding phrase, Vayehi Choshech, and shall darken for them the natural darkness to a higher degree than the darkness of night, i.e., the darkness of night shall become even more black and dark. Should I go on?
So for Rashi, the darkness of night, just because there's so much thought about what was this darkness? Because what's the big question? Why did they just light a candle? Why did you just light it's so dark, light a candle? So, which I think is a fair comment. So what was this?
Yeah.
But for him, he's just saying that he's imagining a darkness that's so dark. But let's see how. Okay, go ahead, continue.
Well, the next thing I have here is Ibn Ezra.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, even darkness which may be felt. That's the
Good word.
Yeah, Yefet says that Vayamesh, which may be felt, is like a Vayamish, and it shall depart from the root Mem Vav Shin, to depart or remove. Compare Lo Yamish Amud Het Anan, the pillar of cloud by day departed not. Okay, its meaning is that the darkness to which they have become accustomed shall depart, and another type of darkness thicker than it shall come. Others say that the Yamesh is missing an olive. I guess that's because that's part of the root of the verb. It should be there. Now, the word emesh in the Holy Tongue refers to the previous night, like emesh yesternight, in spoke unto me yesternight. Now, the meaning of the Yamesh choshech, even darkness which may be felt, is that the Egyptians will feel the darkness with their hands, for the darkness shall be so thick that neither a candle nor a fire shall give off light. They saw not one another, neither by the light of day nor by candlelight, is proof of the aforementioned.
So he's saying it's a supernatural
So
darkness.
you can't even have
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
But no, this is just the ancient rabbis talking about physics at that time, about dark matter. The intuition they had that there was something like dark matter around, I think is very interesting. And of course, the physicists use all the intuition from the ancient rabbis. All of these guys who study physics are into this stuff because they're catching ideas from them. Anyway, so then of course there's a huge mathematical sort of trope about this, which some people even believe now that there is such a thing as dark matter. Anyway.
So you'll see Ibn Ezra, he goes between the two, because Ibn Ezra is a philosopher, and he is interested, as you're saying, in all the elements and how kind of medieval physics, which to us seem a little outdated. But actually, let's skip ahead. If you go to Sforno, I'm just going to read the fourth line. The reason for this inability to interact with light was the density of the texture of this darkness, a result of this totally different kind of darkness. So then Rabbeinu Bachya, who's a Kabbalist, he has a whole thing, and we're not going to go over it, how it says over the heavens, ala shamayim, meaning that Moses had to assert his powers over the heavens. I mean, this is a plague that was so powerful. But I want to take us for a second to the next Ibn Ezra on page 3, and that's where we'll end. And Moses stretched forth. The Egyptians had no way of knowing that 3 days passed except through the Israelites who had light. Now, there are times when a thick darkness comes over the Atlantic Ocean, during which time it is impossible for a person to distinguish between day and night. I think he's talking about fog. And the aforementioned occasionally lasts for as long as 5 days. I myself have been there many times. So go ahead.
No, as we were reading, I thought about pictures I've seen of periods in London
Yes.
Oh,
where the pollution from burning coal and wood and stuff was so bad that it was like, even during the day, it was like the
Night.
middle of
Yeah.
night.
yeah.
Yeah.
And, it's just kind of an example, I guess, of what possibly could have
Happened.
happened, or, to try to relate a real world example of what
Exactly.
they're talking about in the Chumash.
Well, I think what Ibn Ezra is doing is what we're doing too, which is trying to relate to something that's hard to relate to from where we stand and have it make sense from where they are. And of all the stories and all of our scriptures, this is a story that is the most demanding in that sense. And so there's different ways that we relate to it. One is we relate to it metaphorically, and we think about all of our bondages and how our own pharaohs don't let go so easily, and you need a big hand sometimes to be redeemed and to find that, that power of redemption in some ways is no less great than the power that we're reading about in this book. Go ahead.
Why is this little word here? That's shlosh?
Shlishi, that's the third
Shlishi?
aliyah.
Is that what?
Saying what aliyah is, yeah.
Okay, okay.
On the other hand, it also even to us moderns, it challenges us to that story and to that belief of a redeeming God who acts in this way, and that the way our tradition sees it is a traditional point of view. This is just a taste of the final redemption, which we read about in prophets, when our world will be transformed and our world will know peace. Whether that's a physical transformation or a spiritual transformation, I think is, the other point of view is that very common in our tradition is that God used to be a lot more physically present in the world, and as humanity has evolved, God is much less. God now works with hearts and minds and souls, because we're much more. We don't need that anymore. We don't need that because we're in a much different place, and we don't need a third temple because the third temple will be in our heart. And when the world will finally know the final redemption, which is just the taste, God is not really going to make Jerusalem mountains shake and everybody's going to walk to Jerusalem and all the dead will make tunnels into the earth to go, but rather we'll reach a point where humanity will love each other enough that the fabric of the world will have a subtle shift, and where we'll know will be peace and love and compassion, and that will overpower the power of hate and anger. May it be so.